Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org.
This is Dawn Brohawn from the Center for Economic and Social Justice, filling in today as host for Dave Hamill. Today I'm having a conversation with Norm Kurland, president of CESJ, who also happens to be someone I've known all my life, my dad.
Well, thank you, Dawn. It's wonderful to be with you, as we're also going to be celebrating a birthday party for both you and your husband, Roland. So after this, we will have a great meal.
I'm looking forward to it. The 2019 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland closed on January 25th, as you know. Leaders from many nations had gathered to explore major issues and challenges facing the global economy. From the Just Third Way perspective, was there a particular issue or statement that stood out to you as particularly critical for the future of humanity?
Yes, as a matter of fact. The vice president of China, Wang Qisha, made a statement. He said, what we need to do is to make the pie bigger while looking for ways to share it more equitably. Now, that particular statement could not be more relevant than to the ideas that the Center for Economic and Social Justice was formed in 1984. And that is that we're formed to promote just that kind of a vision. And it's surprising to me that China has said that, and yet the United States president has not come close to saying that. And we call our approach, it doesn't follow monopoly capitalism, and it doesn't follow any form of socialism, particularly communism, as is now being exercised in China to the disadvantage of many of its citizens. So we call it the Just Third Way.
Okay, thanks. Well, do you think that China's growing global dominance in the field of artificial intelligence poses a threat to the United States and other countries? If so, what would you do about it? I know you had mentioned a statement from the report from the Davos World Forum mentioning a growing advantage that China has in terms of artificial intelligence. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, there was a newspaper article just last week in which it said China takes the lead on artificial intelligence as U.S. lags. And they're pointing out that China is pouring much of the government money into research on artificial intelligence and development. And as a matter of fact, we compare it to America's very successful approach in dealing with the space race or the Manhattan Project, in which we had to move on this, where the U.S. government funded during the World War II the development of nuclear weapons, and that made a major difference. Obviously, it ended World War II. So what they're doing is something that we should be doing, but we're lagging behind. And I think we should be having something like a Manhattan Project, in which we bring together the finest scientists of the world and engineers to advance artificial intelligence in a way that it's most useful to the development of all citizens of the world. And of course, our major theme is finance and money systems that will expand capital ownership to include not just the top 8 now own more than the bottom 3.6 billion people in the world. So what I think America has to do is to become a model again for justice for all citizens. Although there was a sin in America's beginning, we know that the slavery issue here was bad. But all at the time of the first American Revolution, America was leading other nations in terms of justice for all citizens.
So you were mentioning money systems and financial approaches in order to deal with this the rise of artificial intelligence and robotics and advanced automation, and how that will affect the, as you say, there's a growing gap between the people at the very top of the wealth spectrum and people at the very bottom, which includes 3.5 billion people, many of whom are barely able to subsist, maybe living on $2 a day.
Yeah, it's not only that. Brookings Institution, during the last week, mentioned that 36 million American jobs are going to be vulnerable to automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics. In particular, the jobs of those people at the very bottom, the lowest paid people in our wage system, the cooks, waiters, short-haul drivers, cashiers, clerical office workers, but many others are going to be affected. I notice where students who get law degrees at the finest universities can end up with well over $1 million in student loans, and they expect to get jobs in some of the major law firms in the country, but the law firms no longer need people to do research. They're able to do that with artificial intelligence. So this shows that all kinds of jobs are vulnerable, and that's where we come in with the Just Third Way and the money system that would enable everyone to own the robots, artificial intelligence, and any other advances in the way we can develop the goods and services that we want to consume. So it comes down to, how do you do that? Well, first idea, there are 4 people we would talk about if we went into depth, but I just want to mention Louis Kelso, who was my most important teacher, who advanced the ideas of expanded ownership for all citizens. He was also the inventor of the employee stock ownership plan, in which over 10 million workers have become owners without, many of them, without ever putting up any of their own money. How is that? Well, Kelso, in his second book with Mortimer Adler, the first one had the title of The Capitalist Manifesto, challenging Karl Marx on the property issue. But the second one, and again, I don't use the term capitalism, I think it's thingism. The second book indicated how you could enable people who had no savings to become owners through credit, repayable with future savings. How do you get future savings? You have a tax system which encourages corporations to pay out their profits. They're in the form of dividends. They're made tax deductible so that the banks can be repaid out of the full stream of future profits. So that was Kelso's contribution. He also, in defining money, I find his definition very useful, and that is that money is a yardstick. It isn't what the Federal Reserve says it is. Federal Reserve, when it was formed, was supposed to create money, but it would be asset-backed money. Today, there are no assets behind the U.S. currency, and Kelso would have indicated how that can be done. But you also had another one of my heroes, intellectual heroes, is Buckminster Fuller. And Fuller suggested that there be a new money system globally that could use advances in artificial intelligence and advanced transmission systems, robotics, etc., so that you could have a way of measuring units of money. And he said it could be the price and cost of a kilowatt hour as we developed the ability to produce kilowatts for the globe through a global system. So in any event, what we have to do is use money to provide equal opportunity to every citizen to become an owner. We can do that without taking ownership away from present owners. We want to protect property rights if we're to encourage universal access to ownership. Why? Because without ownership, we're going to be vulnerable to this to the evolution taking place in how we produce wealth. If the machine wants your job, if the robot wants your job, if artificial intelligence wants your job, own them. And Kelso provided the way to do that.
What's interesting to me about the Davos World Forum is that it's bringing together many leaders from many countries and looking beyond national, specifically a national perspective, but now looking to the welfare of everyone on the planet. It raised questions, I would say, in terms of how America's place in the world, and it's how it will define itself as a leader. Many people around the world resent what they feel is America's using its economic and military power to dominate and control other nations. How would you safeguard the national security, freedom, and economic well-being of American citizens while allowing other countries to develop fully for the security, prosperity, and empowerment of all of their citizens?
Right. Well, I think there's a quote from Victor Hugo. He says, "There is one thing that's stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come." I think our problem is we're dealing with obsolete ideas. I think capitalism is an obsolete idea, and it results in a few people being able to be in a position where they can dominate others. But if you have a system where you finance your new growth at faster rates and develop even more advanced technologies than we now have, then people will own them and therefore become productive, or at least contribute to the productive process in ways in which they will get consumption incomes to be able to buy what the growing and more affluent economy can produce. And I think it's very key that in order to thrive in the global marketplace and also is the promotion of justice for every person. And that is, instead of the wage system, in my view, is a slave system. It's a modern form of slavery. It's wage slavery. Those who dominate can hire people as wage owners. You can see what our current president did even with government workers, where 800,000 of them were laid off. That is not just, and I think America is going to have to surface new leaders who are going to be committed to sound principles of justice, economic justice and social justice, properly defined. It's not communism. It's to enable, it's the empowerment, justice that empowers people and also helps them know what do you do when the system is unjust. And Martin Luther King pointed out, peaceful people power, organized. We're able to eliminate the segregation laws. We haven't overcome racism, but there are now moves of people who are behind the just third way to develop what they call the descendants of American slaves. And they want to lead for economic and social justice. And they're looking at even a city to create a city that's now virtually bankrupt, St. Louis. And they're organizing to bring the leaders of St. Louis together with the St. Louis Federal Reserve to have that particular Federal Reserve begin to use the power that's still in the Federal Reserve Act that could enable everyone to become an owner. And it should be used. But in any event, the point is, as Martin Luther King points out, you have to, if in fact the system is unjust, don't worry about those who control it. What you want to do is organize, not to harm anyone, but to bring justice to everyone from the bottom up, without any disadvantage to those who are now in power. Power does tend to corrupt, and the only answer to that is pulverize power so that it spreads out in each human being. Every child, every woman, every man can have access to the means to become an owner through the just third way. And we've developed a law which we call the Capital Homestead Act. But around the world, we should be promoting economic empowerment or economic democracy. And that is what's missing.
Yeah, it's interesting that right now there's so many countries are going through terrible crises, such as in Venezuela or in Zimbabwe. Taking Venezuela, for example, they have, I guess, 1,000,000% inflation going on right now, and people are actually leaving the country because they don't feel there's any future for them there. What are some thoughts you might have?
Well, first of all, Venezuela has one of the largest reserves of oil. Now, the sooner we can leave our fossil fuels in the ground, the better off the environment. But one thing we proposed when the second George Bush was president, before going into Iraq, we said that the oil, who should own the oil? Because Saddam Hussein was able to monopolize the profits from the sale of Iraqi oil. We said, well, why not the citizens? Before you send in troops into Iraq, why not recommend that every citizen should be the owner of the land and natural resources, so that the income from the sale of oil would flow to every child, woman, and man equally as citizens. The same thing can be said for if we had leadership, political leadership, and I'm not so sure I can find much of it in either of the parties, to tell you the truth, or any of the third parties. As a matter of fact, the descendants of American slaves are talking about getting behind a Unite America party, which would be based on the ideas of economic and social justice and ownership for every citizen. So what I would say is that I don't think America or the UN at this point is ready to talk about that, although it's very interesting that the The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed by the UN as its formation in 1948, Article 17 says every person should have the right to own property, personally as well as in association with others. And of course, you shouldn't use your rights and powers of property to harm other people. So it was clear, but no nation in the world yet has a program, but we have proposed one, and we were involved in getting the employee stock ownership plan when I was Kelso's Washington Counsel back in the 70s and late 60s and 70s. But in any event, we have to seek out people who are. And let me say a little about the kind of leaders that we've had in the past. Russell Long, from the senator from Louisiana, was our champion, and from that we were able to get the employee stock ownership plans. Ronald Reagan, back in 1977, spoke before Young Americans for Freedom. He loved the Kelso idea, and he wrote many articles nationally while he was still governor of California. And then when he became president, we were able to get a law to set up a presidential task force on Project Economic Justice, and anybody who's interested in how Ronald Reagan was a supporter of our Just Third Way, they go to the CESJ website and watch the video section and listen to President Reagan as he spoke before all the ambassadors from the Latin American countries. You had Hubert Humphrey was a supporter. George McGovern, I met with him proposing these ideas for the Middle East, and he sent a letter to me saying that if he were running for president today, he would be saying much about the Just Third Way ideas.
Well, I think it's fair to say this is the Just Third Way and the solutions that it offers. It's a big global idea. And let's just say that you were invited to the next World Economic Forum in Davos for 2020, and you were asked to very succinctly state the core message that you would want the people at the conference to be talking about. In 50 words or less, which I know is not easy for you, if you were able to address these world leaders at the World Economic Forum, what would be your core message?
Oh, my core message, it would be get behind Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Create a global monetary system, as Bucky Fuller was suggesting, that would be available for every citizen of the world to get an equal allocation of capital credit so that in his country or wherever else he'd want to invest, he'd be able to get and connect up not just as a worker, but to the most advanced technologies, particularly the types of artificial intelligence. But I would add one other thing. I'd say, Bucky said, we're called to be architects of the future, not its victims. And then he said, and these are the most important words, he says, our challenge, and that's the challenge of the world, is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time with spontaneous cooperation and without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Those would be the words I would use.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Dad.
You've heard this.
Yes, I've heard this, but you always say it in such a fresh way every time. And I hope that this message will get out to other people in our network, but even beyond that, throughout the world. And I really hope that you get an opportunity to speak at the next World Economic Forum in Davos. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dawn, for giving me this opportunity. Now let's go on to dinner.
You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on Participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year, and also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.